Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that anyone is born with an inclination to hate. But sometimes, even in the year 2013, it's easy to forget. Not one of us begins this life hating that which is different. Not one of us begins this life fearing those who are different from ourselves. As children, we recognize differences. We wonder about them and question why. But as children, we don't hate or fear. People must learn to hate. You've got to be taught to hate and fear, carefully taught. In the second act of the great musical South Pacific, Lieutenant Joe Cable sings a song about racial prejudice entitled, "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught." The lyrics of the song confront prejudice at its core, explaining the simple truth that discrimination is not inherent, it's imposed. Imposed by others who once had it imposed upon them in a vicious cycle of prejudice and fear. One isn't born with an inherent aversion to those of a different skin tone. One has to be taught to fear a young, unarmed black man in a hoodie. One has to be taught to fear minorities voting. You've got to be carefully taught. I also believe discrimination plays a role in opposition to same-sex marriage. One isn't born thinking gay people should be treated differently than straight people. One has to be taught to fear equality for all. You've got to be carefully taught. Discrimination has played a role in our immigration policy from the late 19th century to today. But people aren't naturally hostile to those who speak a different language, who come from a different place. They had to be taught to fear the dreamers who are American in all but citizenship, or their parents who risk their lives to make a better life for their children. You've got to be carefully taught. When South Pacific debuted in 1949, the song "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught" almost didn't make the cut. Rodgers and Hammerstein were told the song was too controversial, too preachy, too inappropriate for the musical stage. The song was so controversial that some cities in the Deep South would not allow the musical to be played on their stages. Lawmakers in Georgia even tried to outlaw such entertainment, with one legislator arguing that a song justifying interracial marriage was implicitly a threat to the American way of life. But Rodgers and Hammerstein insisted the song be sung because it told the truth. And nothing combats fear better than the truth. South Pacific premiered more than a half-century ago, yet its lessons are perhaps even more relevant today. We have come a long way since the Jim Crow era, but the truth is that discrimination, while perhaps not as blatant, is alive and well. Despite all the progress we've made, we are still taught to be fearful of differences, to discriminate against those of a different race or background or sexual orientation. And we tragically, although sometimes unknowingly, allow that discrimination to influence our actions. And it's those actions, whether on a street corner in Florida or here on the House of Representatives, that teach yet another generation to hate and fear. As lawmakers, we have a responsibility to root out discrimination, to impart upon a new generation a philosophy of tolerance, and to embrace our differences. By confronting discrimination head-on, we can finally stop the vicious cycle of prejudice and fear. Nelson Mandela said it best. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. You've got to be carefully taught, Mr. Speaker, and the teaching must begin in our hearts and with our children. I yield back.